You wake to the sound of silence, but it is not peace. It is the silence of marble walls hiding screams no one dares to speak of. Rome, the most powerful empire in the known world, breathes with a rotten heartbeat beneath its golden mask. And at the center of that corruption sits a man who believed himself more than human, a man history tried to bury beneath scandal and madness, but whose shadow still whispers in the corridors of power today. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but the world remembers him only as Caligula. The little boots who grew into the monster emperor. Imagine being summoned to his palace at midnight. The torches burn low, their light trembling against silk curtains soaked with perfume, wine, and sweat. You walk across a floor scattered with rose petals, each one bruised under the feet of senators and slaves. But the scent of flowers does not mask the air, it reeks of incense, blood, and something darker. In the great hall, Caligula waits. Not in armor, not in the robes of a statesman, but draped in garments stolen from the temples of gods. He does not sit upon a throne. He lounges as if the empire itself were his bed. Around him, women not their own, men stripped of rank, are arranged like living decorations. He does not speak to them, he commands their silence with a glance, as though their humiliation is the only language he wishes Rome to learn. The truth no one dares to whisper is this: Caligula's reign was not simply excess, it was ritual. His perversions were not the private sickness of a deranged ruler, but deliberate acts of psychological warfare. He understood the most terrifying secret of power, that once a man can force another to betray his own dignity in public, he owns not just his body, but his soul. Every grotesque banquet, every ritual of degradation, was not random madness, but a performance staged to remind the elite that they were already conquered. Rome's Senate thought they held authority, Caligula proved they were actors in his theater, props to his appetite. You were never meant to hear this, but here is the first truth: tyranny does not begin with swords. It begins with rituals of humiliation, repeated until they feel normal. And Caligula perfected this art until even Rome's strongest men forgot what resistance looked like. The empire called it entertainment. But behind the marble doors, what unfolded was no feast, no pleasure, no luxury. It was theater designed to break the human spirit. Caligula understood something his enemies never did, that shame is a weapon sharper than steel. And so, he turned Rome itself into his stage, where the most powerful men and women were forced into roles they could never refuse. Picture the Senate, once the proud body that guided the destiny of the Republic, now reduced to trembling guests at Caligula's midnight banquets. Senators and generals, men who commanded legions, forced to sit quietly as their wives and daughters were paraded before the emperor like offerings at a sacrificial altar. At his command, a noblewoman might be stripped bare before the assembly, compelled to recite prayers not to Venus, but to Caligula himself, as though he were the living god of lust. These rituals did not happen in shadows, they happened before the very eyes of Rome's elite, who sat rigid, staring into their wine cups, pretending not to see their own families desecrated in service of the emperor's craving for control. He did not stop at wives. He reached for sisters, for daughters, for sacred bonds no Roman dared violate. The lines between family, state, and the divine were blurred until nothing was left but his will. Imagine the psychological destruction: fathers unable to protect their children, brothers unable to defend their sisters, leaders of armies reduced to silent spectators while their lineage was defiled before their eyes. And in this silence, Caligula laughed, because he had discovered the ultimate form of dominance, not through death, but through the slow, public death of dignity. Historians have painted him as insane, but what if that madness was method? What if Caligula understood that true control requires stripping away not just power, but identity? By corrupting sacred rituals, by forcing Rome's leaders into his sexual theater, he rewired the psychology of an empire. No senator could rise against him when his own household shame was chained to the emperor's secrets. No general could revolt when his loyalty had been tested in the most perverse trials imaginable. This was not indulgence. This was strategy. His feasts were not orgies of pleasure, they were laboratories of power, where he dissected the human spirit like a butcher testing the limits of flesh. And Rome, blinded by its own decadence, let it happen. You were told Caligula was mad. But ask yourself, was he insane? Or was he simply willing to wield weapons others feared, humiliation, desecration, and ritualized perversion as tools of absolute control? Rome always prided itself on the balance between gods and men. Emperors were rulers by divine blessing, not deities themselves. That fragile line was the last illusion that kept power from collapsing into tyranny. But Caligula shattered it. He did not want to be blessed by the gods, he wanted to replace them. And he would use Rome's most sacred rituals as his stage. In the temples of Jupiter and Venus, marble statues were mutilated, their heads torn off and replaced with his own likeness. Imagine the sight, worshippers kneeling before Jupiter's body, but staring into the pale, youthful face of Caligula. Across the empire, priests were forced to rewrite prayers, replacing the names of gods with the emperor's. His cult was not religion, it was psychological warfare, demanding Romans desecrate their own beliefs by pretending the divine itself wore his skin. But the true corruption unfolded not in temples, but in his private chambers. Here, Caligula staged ceremonies that blended the sacred with the obscene. He commanded senators' wives to offer themselves before his golden statue, as if their flesh were sacrifices to the emperor's divinity. Rituals once reserved for the goddess Venus were twisted into parodies where the women of Rome, mothers, daughters, sisters, became living vessels of his false godhood. To resist was impossible, to comply was to betray the gods themselves. This was no accident. It was design. And then there was Drusilla, his beloved sister. Roman whispers claimed he elevated her beyond mortal rank, calling her goddess, priestess, and wife all at once. At feasts, she sat beside him not as kin, but as divine consort, her presence a declaration that no boundary was sacred, not family, not faith, not flesh. When she died, Caligula demanded the Senate deify her, forcing Rome's leaders to worship the memory of the sister they suspected he had already defiled in life. Think of what this means. Religion was no longer a path to the gods. It was a mirror, reflecting only Caligula's hunger. By fusing sexual degradation with divine ritual, he created a cult where humiliation itself was worship, and the emperor's perversion became the new holy law. And here lies the hidden truth: power does not need your belief, it needs your obedience. Once you kneel, even in mockery, you are conquered. Caligula understood this. That is why he turned worship into theater, sex into ceremony, and Rome's soul into his possession. Rome was not ruled by laws, it was ruled by spectacle. And Caligula knew that if the people could not witness his rituals directly, they could be made to believe them through rumor, through whispers, through the carefully cultivated theater of scandal. He weaponized not just the body, but the imagination of an entire empire. The banquets of the Palatine became the seed of legend. Stories spread like wildfire, senators' wives stripped in front of golden statues, noble daughters treated as offerings, Caligula laughing as the most sacred ties of blood and honor were violated. Did all of these rituals truly happen? Perhaps not. But Caligula understood the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that Rome believed he was capable of anything. And once that belief took root, fear alone ruled the empire. He extended the performance beyond the palace. In public games, he ordered prostitutes dressed as goddesses to dance among the crowds, mocking the divine with gestures of obscene devotion. During gladiatorial contests, he would pause the slaughter, stand before tens of thousands, and casually choose a man from the audience to be dragged into the arena, sometimes for execution, sometimes for forced humiliation. Rome learned a cruel lesson: pleasure and terror were interchangeable in the emperor's hands. The people laughed, they gasped, they whispered, but beneath it all, they obeyed. Because Caligula had shifted the boundaries of the possible. If he could corrupt Venus, if he could desecrate Jupiter, if he could force senators to watch their wives humiliated without raising a hand, then what couldn't he do? His legend became more powerful than his sword. He didn't need to control every man, he only needed every man to imagine that he might be next. Do you see the brilliance in the madness? He blurred the line between rumor and ritual until fear itself became the ritual. Rome's masses did not need to be invited into his chambers, they carried his chambers inside their minds. They reenacted his theater in whispers, in gossip, in shudders of disgust that only deepened their submission. And here lies the warning: institutions rule not only through force, but through imagination. The moment people believe resistance is impossible, it already is. Caligula mastered this art. He didn't just command Rome's bodies. He colonized their thoughts. Power is not secure until it reshapes the human soul. Caligula knew this. He understood that the most effective chains were invisible, forged not of iron, but of shame. A man shackled in the dungeon might still dream of freedom. But a man who has betrayed himself, who has been made to participate in his own humiliation, will never rise again. That was Caligula's secret art. Consider the senators. These were men who once carried the memory of the Republic, men descended from generals, philosophers, and kings. And yet, under Caligula, they were made to sit at feasts where their wives were summoned to his bed before their eyes. Some were commanded to applaud. Others were forced to recite praises as their daughters were led away into chambers from which only laughter and the stench of incense returned. Do you see the strategy? It was not enough to violate them. He required their silence, their participation. To resist would have meant death. To comply meant life, but at the cost of everything that made them men. And slowly, the Senate broke. They became hollowed vessels, shadows in purple robes, eyes fixed on the floor, lips whispering prayers not to gods, but to the emperor's moods. Caligula had cracked their spirit without striking a single blow. He had proven that Rome's leaders would sell their dignity for survival. That knowledge was more intoxicating to him than wine, more arousing than flesh. Because once a man accepts humiliation as normal, he is no longer a man, he is property. This is why the rituals grew more obscene, more grotesque, more unthinkable. Not because Caligula's appetite demanded escalation, but because he was testing the limits of control. How far could he push? How much could he defile before Rome broke? And each time the Senate sat in silence, each time the generals averted their gaze, each time a father pretended not to see his daughter disgraced, the answer was clear: there were no limits. And now I turn to you, listening in the present. You must understand, this is not just history. This is a mirror. Because every age has its Caligulas, every empire its rituals of humiliation. They may not wear crowns, they may not sit on thrones, but they use the same tools: shame, spectacle, obedience. And just like Rome, men still trade dignity for survival. So let me ask you now, directly, if you hear these words and feel the sting of truth, comment this phrase twice below: I refuse the ritual. Say it once for yourself, and once to remind the world that identity can be defended, even when empires demand its surrender. Caligula's reign was not merely the story of one man's madness, it was the story of an empire unraveling under the weight of its own silence. Every ritual of humiliation, every banquet of perversion, every whispered rumor carved cracks into the foundations of Rome. For how long can a society pretend that its leaders still rule with dignity when they kneel before a boy who calls himself a god? The Senate became a graveyard of cowards. Once, these men debated laws, argued over policy, fought for the Republic's fading memory. Under Caligula, they became performers in his sadistic theater, clapping at the degradation of their own households. The generals, once feared across the known world, became eunuchs in spirit, men who could conquer nations but not defend their own homes from a single emperor's appetite. And the people? They were entertained into submission, drunk on the spectacle of their rulers' madness, too fascinated by scandal to recognize the slow death of liberty. But here lies the hidden truth: Caligula was not an anomaly. He was a revelation. He showed the world that institutions can survive without honor, without justice, without morality, so long as fear and entertainment are combined in the right dose. This is why his name still haunts history. Because even after his assassination, even after his blood stained the marble of the Palatine, the blueprint he created remained. Do you think modern institutions are immune? Look closer. Leaders who humiliate rather than lead. Systems that keep you distracted with spectacle, divided by rumor, broken by shame. Entire nations addicted to entertainment, while power moves in shadows, unchecked, unseen. Caligula understood that if you keep men laughing, gasping, and whispering, they will never rise. They will surrender everything, family, faith, identity, just to keep their place at the table. Rome thought itself immortal. Yet within a century of Caligula's reign, the empire was already hollowing, its strength bleeding away, its soul corrupted beyond repair. Caligula was not its end, he was its infection, the first visible symptom of a disease that would rot the empire from within. And here is the warning: when corruption becomes ritual, when humiliation becomes law, when spectacle replaces truth, collapse is inevitable. It is not a matter of if. It is a matter of when, and so, the story ends in blood. January 41 AD, Caligula walks the corridors of his palace, certain of his immortality. He believes himself untouchable, a god clothed in flesh, a ruler of rituals who has bent Rome itself to his will. But in the shadows, daggers wait. His own guards, men who have endured his humiliations, can take no more. In a burst of violence, the emperor who claimed to be divine is cut down like a common criminal, his body hacked apart, his divinity leaking into the marble floor in streams of red. The god dies like a man. But don't be deceived. His death did not kill his legacy. The blueprint he left behind, that power is best secured not by loyalty, not by justice, but by ritualized humiliation, remains alive in every empire that followed. Rome replaced Caligula with another emperor. The rituals changed their form. The stage became subtler. But the principle remained. Break a man's dignity, and you will never need to break his body. Look at the world around you. Do you see the echoes? Institutions that laugh at morality. Leaders who turn shame into law. Systems that force you to play roles you never chose, repeating rituals of obedience disguised as tradition, entertainment, or necessity. Tell me, what is the difference between a senator applauding his wife's humiliation at Caligula's table, and a modern man applauding systems that rob him of freedom while he smiles and obeys? The empire never ended. It simply changed costume. And here you are, listening. You have descended into a truth most will never hear. History is not distant. It is a mirror. And the reflection staring back at you is asking a question: will you participate in the ritual? Or will you refuse? Caligula's Rome fell because men surrendered their dignity long before they surrendered their lives. That is how empires die, not with a scream, but with a bow, a silence, a laugh at the wrong moment. The only shield you have against such corruption is awareness, and the courage to say no. So I leave you with this dangerous knowledge that cannot be unlearned: the ritual is still here. It wears new faces, speaks new words, but it feeds on the same obedience. If you carry this truth with you, you are no longer blind. Now, speak it into existence one final time in the comments below: I refuse the ritual. I refuse the ritual. Let the words echo. Because once you see the ritual, you cannot be controlled by it again.